I'm going to be talking a bit about racial segregation and what we can do to challenge it in all communities. So it's not just in the divested, segregated Black communities that we need to work on, but we also need to have strategies and movements and allies and organizations working in the segregated white suburban communities as well. We need all of this. So I'm going to cover sort of a broad spectrum. And I'm going to start sort of high-level view. So we have this idea in this country that segregation, the segregation of our neighborhoods, is what's called de facto segregation. That means that it wasn't caused by government or laws or policies, that it was caused by personal preferences, people who like to live around people who look like them, or is caused just by private actors, maybe bigoted, racist landlords and mortgage brokers and lenders, real estate agents who refuse to sell or rent homes to African Americans in white neighborhoods. And we leave government out of it. We say the government wasn't responsible. It was private actors, or it happened by accident. Now, when we think that something happened by accident, it can only unhappen by accident. We don't have any agency to do anything or any responsibility to do anything about it. Well, in 2017, my father, Richard Rothstein, he wrote The Color of Law, and that book, the entire premise of that book, was to debunk this de facto segregation idea. He called it a myth. And so you don't have to listen to me talk for too long. There's a film that was made out of The Color of Law that my dad narrated. It's called Segregated by Design. You can find it online, segregatedbydesign.com, made by Mark Lopez, and we're just going to watch a couple little clips from it. So, Tony, here we go.
We have been led to believe that racial segregation in housing was de facto segregation, by accident or the result of private prejudices. Yes, private prejudice clearly contributed to segregation, but by itself it could not have segregated the country without the intention of the federal government to segregate neighborhoods throughout the nation. If, however, we understand the accurate history, the history that was once well known but we've all now forgotten, that racially segregated patterns in every metropolitan area like St. Louis were created by de jure segregation, racially explicit policy on the part of federal, state, and local governments designed to segregate metropolitan areas, then we can understand that we have an unconstitutional residential landscape. And if it's unconstitutional, then we have an obligation to remedy it. The federal government in the New Deal of the Roosevelt administration of the 1930s pursued policies in the mid-20th century that segregated metropolitan areas. One important policy was the first civilian public housing program, which frequently demolished integrated neighborhoods in order to create segregated public housing. In the late 1930s, another New Deal program, the United States Housing Authority, was adopted. The very first projects built under the United States Housing Authority authorization were in Austin, Texas, because the most aggressive proponent of public housing at that time was the congressman from Austin, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And Johnson got the United States Housing Authority to put its first projects in Austin, separate projects for whites, for African Americans, and a project for Hispanics. The project for African Americans was placed in a location that the city plan of Austin had designated as a ghetto for African Americans. The United States Housing Authority and the local Austin Housing Authority demolished something called Emancipation Park, which was a celebrations location for the abolition of slavery. The design was to move all African Americans in the city of Austin into this community, whether in public housing or in private housing. The city of Austin then began to close schools for African Americans elsewhere in the city and close libraries and other public facilities to force African Americans to move to the east side. Another program that the federal government pursued to enforce segregation was the work of the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, which subsidized the development of suburbs like Levittown, New York, on condition that they only be sold to white families and that the homes in those suburbs had deeds that prohibited resale to African Americans. The Federal Housing Administration's underwriting manual said that inharmonious racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities, meaning that loans to African Americans could not be insured. Government at all levels throughout the nation were involved in promoting and enforcing the restrictive deeds in homes and places like Levittown, and judges enforced the view that these deeds did not violate the Constitution because they were private agreements. Although white middle-class families that moved into suburbs like Levittown could buy property with no down payments if they were veterans and low-interest mortgages, middle-class African Americans had to make substantial down payments and get uninsured mortgages with higher interest rates. In many, if not most cases, African Americans could not get mortgages at all because the federal government would not insure them.
All right, so those are two examples. Public housing, how the public housing program in this country started, created segregation where it didn't exist in cities all over the country. The way the Federal Housing Administration created suburbs around the country and limited them to be accessible only to white families, and explicitly prohibited African Americans from buying into those suburbs when they were affordable. Those are two examples of government policies that created and sustained segregation. There are only two of many. The Color of Law is filled with many more. The film is filled with many more. Racialized zoning, for example, state-sanctioned racial violence against African Americans who moved into white neighborhoods, highway construction, urban renewal, removal of African American neighborhoods to build freeways, or to intend to build freeways that then were never built. These are all government policies that created segregation and sustained the segregation of our communities. So I hope it's obvious now, and it probably already was before I got up here, that it wasn't de facto segregation that created, it wasn't a de facto process that created segregation in this country. It was purely caused by government policy. And although there were private actors involved, those private actors, their actions were incentivized and often required by federal government to ensure that they created segregated communities. Now, we might hear this and think, sure, those government policies, that happened. Sure, it wasn't de facto segregation back then when it was created, but those policies are over. We now have the Fair Housing Act that was passed in 1968 that said you can no longer discriminate in the sale and rental of housing. So the government policy has reformed, and we're past that, and we should move on. Well, I know none of us believe that, but we're going to watch another short clip to just lay the context of why this is still an issue that we should care about. Tony.
Today, African American incomes are about 60% of white incomes. But African American wealth is about 10% of white wealth. Most middle-class families in this country gain their wealth from the equity they have in their homes. So this enormous difference between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to federal housing policy implemented through the 20th century. African American families that were prohibited from buying homes in the suburbs in the 1940s and 50s, and even into the 60s by the Federal Housing Administration, gained none of the equity appreciation that whites gained. Across the country in new developments, these homes in the late 1940s and 1950s sold for about twice national median income. They were affordable to working-class families with an FHA or VA mortgage. African Americans were equally able to afford those homes as whites, but were prohibited from buying them. Today, those homes sell for $300,000 to $400,000 at the minimum, 6 to 8 times national median income. The white families sent their children to college with the wealth they gained from appreciating home equity. They were able to take care of their parents in old age and not depend on their children. They were able to bequeath wealth to their children. None of those advantages accrued to African Americans who, for the most part, were prohibited from buying homes in those suburbs. So in 1968, we passed the Fair Housing Act that said, in effect, okay, African Americans, you're now free to buy homes in the suburbs that had been forbidden. But it's an empty promise, because those homes are no longer affordable to the families whose parents or grandparents could have afforded them when whites were buying into those suburbs and gaining the equity and wealth that followed from their purchases. Consider children who come from families where they're economically stressed, or in poor health because they have no access to good health care, or because they live in polluted environments. When they do come to school, for example, they may suffer from asthma because of that pollution and are drowsy from being awake at night, wheezing. They cannot then typically achieve at levels of children who come to school well rested. When you concentrate children like that in single classrooms, it's impossible for teachers to develop the kind of outcomes that they can in middle-class children who come to school healthy, unstressed, and able to pay attention to schooling. What economists know is that African American children from low-income families who grow up in segregated neighborhoods are less likely as adults to move into the middle class than are African American children whose families have the same low incomes but who live in integrated neighborhoods. So segregation itself impedes intergenerational mobility and perpetuates, rigidifies the inequality that we experience. Another thing that social psychologists have discovered is that decision-making is hampered when you don't have diverse decision-making groups. These psychologists have done experiments where they put people together to solve problems in both diverse groups and in segregated groups. And the diverse groups are much better able to solve problems because they challenge assumptions much more than the segregated groups do. So segregation impedes our political and economic success. We have 3 provisions in the federal Constitution that prohibit the kinds of actions that federal, state, and local governments pursued to create residential segregation. One is the Fifth Amendment, which requires the federal government to treat all citizens fairly. Another is the 14th Amendment that requires state and local governments not only to treat citizens fairly, but to treat them equally. And then the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, also requires that we banish the effects of slavery, which Congress long ago determined was any form of second-class citizenship. So in fact, the prohibition on African Americans to purchase homes in federally subsidized white communities or the segregation of public housing created a form of second-class citizenship which was a violation of the 13th Amendment. We cannot reverse de jure segregation mainly with lawsuits. We must also build a national political consensus leading to legislation, a challenging but not impossible task. Our focus now should be to develop policies that promote an integrated society, understanding it will be impossible to fully untangle the web of unconstitutional inequality that we've woven. To begin, we should first contemplate what we have collectively done and, on behalf of our government, accept responsibility to fix it.
All right. So that film did a great job of summarizing The Color of Law, and that book also ended with that challenge, that we have, as a country, all of us, African Americans, whites, other races, nationalities, have a responsibility to remedy the segregation that our government created. It created that segregation in violation of the Constitution, and when our government violates the Constitution and we reckon with that fact, we have an obligation to remedy the harms that that violation created. But so far, we haven't stepped up to this obligation. And one reason my dad and I thought that perhaps one reason we haven't stepped up to that obligation is because it's not entirely clear how we do that. So we wrote Just Action, the book that we co-authored to follow the color of law, to describe what we can do in our own communities to start to challenge segregation and to remedy its ongoing impacts. So what we argue in Just Action is that to live up to this obligation to remedy segregation and challenge it in our own communities, we need to build a newly activated civil rights movement that is taking on this issue. The civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s made a lot of gains in a lot of arenas, but it left residential segregation untouched. And so we need to continue that movement by taking on segregation head on. And there's a lot of ways that we can do that. And when I talk about an activated civil rights movement, I'm talking about more than book clubs or discussion groups or awareness-raising activities like Black Lives Matter signs on front lawns in suburban communities or other sort of, more performative actions that have come out of the 2020 racial reckoning in this country. We need to turn that awareness building into action. And as we saw, segregation has real impacts and consequences on our lives, the lives of our families, our communities, our country. It impedes the growth, the economic growth of our country as a whole. And so not only do we have a responsibility, but we have an obligation to do something about it. Now, we filled up an entire book of things that we can do to challenge segregation in our communities because we wanted to show that it might not be easy. This kind of change is never really easy, but it's not impossible. So what we argue in Just Action is that to build this newly activated civil rights movement, to make progress on challenging segregation, we need to start locally. You know, we understand that the federal government had a large role to play in creating segregation, but to a large extent, once that segregation is created, it's sustained and maintained by local policies. So there's a lot of local policies and programs that can be changed or adopted or challenged that will go a long way towards challenging segregation. And we have a little more control and a little more impact on local issues than we do, particularly right now on federal national politics. So we can leave all that noise, the federal sort of political noise, out of the way and focus locally in our own communities and make real progress. So every strategy that we describe in Just Action, we also give an example of a community somewhere in the country that has adopted that strategy, successfully implemented in their community, and has seen some movement and some success. So what we start with in Just Action is that to build this newly activated civil rights movement, we need to start by building biracial, multi-ethnic committees in our own communities that can take on this issue. Now, we understand that this in itself might seem daunting. We live in segregated communities, so many of us see people who look like us when we go about our daily business. Our social ties, our social connections outside of the workplace tend to be with people of the same race. But in order to build this movement, we need, as Dr. Williams said, white people to take responsibility and to get involved in Black-led organizations. We need involvement from African American organizations and leadership and community members. We need to be able to work together to work on these issues. And to do that, we have to start to build social relationships across racial lines, even if that means meeting and getting to know someone from the other side of town. That's what it will take, because these kind of movements are built on social capital. You know, relationships, trust, time knowing each other, knowing we can work together and depend on each other in these, you know, sometimes challenging, vulnerable ways of working towards social change. So again, daunting but not impossible. We give several examples in Just Action of groups that have done this. One example is from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, where there were 6 Presbyterian churches in the city, 3 on the white side of town, 3 on the black side of town, very segregated congregations. And there was some racial unrest in their city a couple decades ago. And the pastors of these 6 congregations decided they wanted to do something about it and start an interracial dialogue group. So they formed what they called the Presbyterian Interracial Dialogue, PIRD. And it started with 40 members, 20 were white, 20 African American, and they started just talking about the racial issues in their city, got to know each other, and they maintained that racial balance. So when one person wanted to move out of this group, they were replaced by someone of the same race. And it went on for many years. They developed relationships outside of this group. They learned about issues in their community. They went on to advocate for a citizen police review board in their city, for adopting an African American history curriculum in their school district, and then went on to build some Habitat for Humanity homes together. So this is an example of these pastors took the initial step to bring this group together, and it built relationships and led to some change in their community. So again, might be difficult, but we're all used to doing difficult things, I think. It's not impossible, so it's helpful to learn and hear about other groups that have done this. So often these groups, when they start to learn about the history of their own communities and what government policies created the segregation of their own communities. Sometimes it's seeing those racially restrictive covenants were mentioned in the film that the federal government required to be put on homes that helped to finance, saying that only whites could ever own that home or occupy that home. Now, those covenants, they're no longer legally enforceable. Again, those laws have been changed, but they remain on the deeds of homes forever. And so sometimes people find these on the deeds of their homes, and it gets them curious about, how did this happen? I didn't think this happened in my neighborhood, in my block, on my house. And they start to inventory and map out where these covenants existed so they can start to understand how this federal policy, impacted their own communities. And then that can help build awareness and bring more people into the group to then do something about it. Because, again, it gives us, some agency back in the equation. Because even though we don't want to see that, we don't want to see evidence of that despicable history on the deeds of our own homes. But once we do, you can see that it wasn't an accident. It's not some magical occurrence that our community looks the way it does. It was an intentional action written in black and white on the deed of your home. And once you see that intentional action created it, you can start to see that intentional action can undo it and challenge it. So it helps, again, give us some agency and inspiration to do something about it. So then what do? Well, we give in our book a lot of examples of what groups can do, local policies and programs, strategies to address, challenge, redress, remedy segregation. And they do two things. They look to the future, because we can't continue to create segregated communities if we're to challenge segregation today. So we have to look at forward-looking policies. And they also look to the past. We can't only look to the future and think we'll solve this problem without remedying the harms that compound over the years. So the wealth gap that we saw in the film, right? That means that the African Americans, there's a huge wealth gap, and it's a lot harder to buy a home when you don't have intergenerational wealth, gifts from your parents or grandparents to help buy a home. And so we can't just look to the future and say, well, now, like the Fair Housing Act did, we no longer discriminate if we don't address those ongoing impacts from past policies like the wealth gap. So we need to look to the future and the past to remedy and challenge. And then the strategies we talk about, they fall into two main categories. One are place-based strategies, which I think you all have been talking a lot about this week. These are strategies concerned with increasing investments in segregated African American communities, where the lack of investments and resources are a direct result of government policy and government-sponsored segregation. So to remedy the impacts of that government policy, we want to increase investments and resources in those communities, make those areas of high opportunity. Now, we also understand that often when that happens, like Dr. Williams alluded to earlier, when you increase investments in a lower income community, often people with higher incomes suddenly become interested in living there. We call this gentrification. They move in, drive up the housing costs, and the longtime residents of that community are displaced and have to leave their neighborhood just when it starts to see an increase in investment. So we couple these place-based strategies with anti-displacement strategies to prevent some of the displacement that can occur when investments and resources increase. So some of these strategies have to do with rent control, so limiting how quickly rent can rise in those areas, because often when gentrification is happening, landlords will just jack up rents to get their lower paying tenants out to bring higher paying tenants in. So protections for renters against that kind of activity. Also, just cause eviction ordinances. Again, this is another locally passed law that requires or prohibits landlords from evicting tenants except for a just cause, like failure to pay rent or massive property damage. So they can't just kick people out because they have a higher paying tenant wanting to move in. A right to counsel program, again, this is a locally passed program that funds attorneys to represent lower income tenants who are facing evictions. Oftentimes, tenants who are facing an eviction don't have access to legal representation. Their landlords do. They usually have no recourse in court to defend themselves or to stay in their units unless they have access to free legal representation, which a right to counsel program can provide them. And it changes the balance of power a lot in those courtrooms. Another policy is inclusionary zoning, another locally passed policy by cities or counties that requires when new housing is built in an area, a certain percentage of the units have to be sold or rented at affordable prices. So that's a way of ensuring that when new development is happening in an area, at least some of the new units are affordable to the longtime residents of that community. Now we go a little further and argue that those new units, affordable units created, should have some preferences put on them to ensure that the people who actually live in that community and are at risk of displacement have access to those units. Another strategy that does all of these things, increasing investment, home ownership opportunities, preventing displacement, is starting or expanding a land trust, a community land trust. Are you all familiar with community land trusts? Some people, yeah. So really quickly, a land trust is a nonprofit organization, and they provide affordable home ownership opportunities, usually in areas that are gentrifying and seeing rapidly increasing home costs. So they prevent displacement by providing affordable ways for people to stay in their community as housing costs are rising. And they allow access to home ownership to people who otherwise wouldn't be able to afford it. And the way they do that is a land trust will acquire land. Sometimes local government donates land. It could be a local church or congregation that has unused or underutilized land that it could donate to a land trust or work with a land trust to create homes on that land. So the land trust then builds the homes and sells them for affordable prices to lower or moderate income homeowners. And that homeowner owns the home like any other homeowner, but they get it for an affordable price because in the transaction, the land trust retains ownership of the land underneath the home. They just sell the house. The rapidly increasing cost of land is one of the reasons for the rapidly increasing cost of housing, one of the primary reasons. So when you take the cost of land out of the cost of that house, it's a lot more affordable. So the homeowner owns that home like any other homeowner. They get it for an affordable price, and when they want to sell the home, they agree to adhere to a maximum resale price that the land trust establishes to ensure that the home is affordable to the next home buyer. It's one of the only ways to create permanently affordable home ownership opportunities without resubsidizing at every sale to bring the cost back down. Now, the one drawback is that those homeowners, when they sell the home, they don't earn the full equity that they would if they sold it at market rate, which is a drawback, but they do often earn enough equity to be able to afford another home somewhere else or in the same community. So it is a limited equity arrangement. That's why it's one of many strategies in the toolbox to help create home ownership opportunities. And the families who get into land trust homes, they wouldn't be able to get into a market rate home without a limited equity arrangement. So it's a way to get them a foot in the door into the home ownership experience. So there's over 300 communities around the country with a land trust. We wrote about one in Durham, North Carolina, that started when a group of residents of a lower income African American neighborhood just started talking to each other about what they wanted to see differently in their community. And they started by identifying that they wanted a park. There wasn't a safe place for kids to play. They were playing in the streets. And so they advocated that the city turn a vacant lot into a park, and they won, and that got them excited and interested. What else can we do? And at the time, their neighborhood was gentrifying. They were near Duke University. Prices were rising as Duke was expanding enrollment. So they learned about the land trust model, and they started one, and they started with 2 homes that they actually, I think, crowdfunded donations to buy that land from the city. They built these 2 homes, and they sold them at affordable prices. They sold them at the time about $100,000 in today's money. And now their homes, they have over 300 properties all around the city of Durham, both rental and home ownership. Their homes now sell for $150,000, so slightly less affordable than when they started, but the homes in the surrounding neighborhood sell for $500,000. So a lot more affordable than the market rate homes. So again, an example of what you can do just when you start talking to your neighbors and learn about the ways out there of creating change in your own community. So land trust, a great example. What we can do with that example is finding out if there's a land trust in our community and support it with resources, time, or help ensure that that land trust can expand its portfolio of homes by having access to more land. We can do that by advocating that the local government where we live donate some of its unused land to a land trust. Local governments all over the country in all kinds of communities are sitting on vacant or unused land, and they could donate just a part of that to a land trust to build affordable home ownership opportunities in those communities. Churches, congregations with underused land can do the same. We can also go back to those restrictive covenants I talked about earlier. Those restrictive covenants, again, no longer legally enforceable, but they're in the public official record of that home. And those covenants, along with saying that the home can only ever be owned or occupied by whites, also list the companies that were involved, with building and selling that home when it was first sold. So the builder, the developer, the realtor, the bank that first financed the home. Oftentimes, and we did research in a few communities, And those 4 companies listed on those deeds are often still in business in our communities, or if they aren't, they've been acquired by another company that is in business. So we looked at some of these covenants in Charlottesville, Virginia, and the bank, the builder, the developer, and the realtor are all either still in business or have been acquired by another company that is in Charlottesville today. Many of these companies put statements on their website in 2020 after George Floyd's murder saying that they support Black Lives Matter, racial justice. So this is another thing we can do in our own communities is go back to those companies and say, look, if you really do support these aims and want to reconcile with your responsibility for creating the segregation of this community, you need to contribute to remedies, and one way they can do that is supporting a land trust. So that's an example of a strategy for increasing investments and limiting displacement in gentrifying or lower income segregated communities. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, we also equally importantly need strategies to open up exclusive, expensive, predominantly white, usually suburban communities to diverse residents, to those people who are non-white who want to live in those communities. You know, we don't want to limit choices or options for anyone. And those communities, have a history of being very exclusionary. They're not all white for no reason. They were created that way and intentionally kept that way. And so there's a lot of things we can do to change how those communities look to ensure that they are desegregated as well. We call these mobility strategies. So some of these include changing zoning. This is a big issue today in the housing crisis that the country is in. One of the reasons we are in a housing affordability crisis is because our country hasn't built enough housing to keep up with demand over the last several decades. One of the reasons why we haven't done that is because of exclusionary zoning. Communities that zone themselves to only allow one house per lot anywhere in their community. Now, most of the residentially zoned land in this country is zoned to allow only one home per lot. It's called single-family only zoning. It ensures that the homes in that community will remain expensive and unaffordable to anyone but those who have intergenerational wealth and who were allowed into home ownership when it was affordable. Now, those homes remain expensive because those communities can't build more homes as demand rises. So as demand rises, the prices just go up. So we need to reform zoning around the country to address the affordable housing crisis we're in, but we also need to reform zoning to desegregate those all-white communities because little known history of zoning is that single-family only zoning was born out of racialized zoning. It used to be that cities zoned their neighborhoods by race, saying this is a zone for only whites, this is a zone for African Americans. That was found to be unconstitutional. So in its place, cities zoned those white areas for single-family only use, and that ensured that they stayed all white. So again, once we understand this history and how it came to be, we can see that challenging these laws that we still operate under is an important first step towards challenging the segregation of our communities. So another important mobility strategy has to do with Section 8 housing choice vouchers. Now, I'm sure we've all heard of the program or familiar with it. It's the largest federal rental subsidy in the country for lower income tenants, helps them afford rental units. All around the country, there's 2 million recipients of Section 8. They're disproportionately African American families. And the idea when Section 8 was created was to allow lower income families the opportunity, if they wanted, to leave high poverty areas to move to higher opportunity areas. Areas with access to well-resourced public schools, open space, clean air, well-resourced libraries, access to jobs and transportation. Because the Section 8 voucher benefit is mobile. It's not tied to a building or, to a unit in a public housing building or development. You can use it to rent anywhere in the private market. So the intention was that it would allow lower income tenants to leave high poverty areas if they wanted. Is it working that way? No. Only 5% of Section 8 families can use their voucher to rent in high opportunity communities. And white Section 8 recipients are more likely to be able to use their voucher to rent in these high opportunity communities than African American Section 8 tenants. Now, one reason for this is discrimination, not surprisingly, but racial discrimination in housing is illegal, but discrimination against people who use Section 8 to pay their rent is actually legal in the federal government's eyes. It's sort of incomprehensible to think that the federal government created a benefit and then allows landlords to discriminate against people who use that benefit. That's how it is. So it's legal in the federal level, but many states and localities have outlawed this kind of discrimination. So there's about 20 states and 100 cities and counties that have adopted what are called source of income discrimination ordinances. And these say that it's illegal to discriminate against tenants who use, just because they use Section 8 to pay their rent. So based on the source of their income, you can't deny a tenant access to a unit if they're otherwise qualified. So if we live in an area that doesn't have a source of income discrimination ordinance, that's an important first step to advocate adopting one so that Section 8 tenants don't face discrimination. And then we all know that adopting an anti-discrimination ordinance is not the end of the story. Once it's on the books, we then have to make sure that it's enforced. That includes educating landlords that they can't discriminate against Section 8 tenants, educating Section 8 voucher holders to know when they're being discriminated against and what to do about it, and then also monitoring and enforcing when that discrimination occurs. Now, the only real way to know when that discrimination is occurring is through what's called paired testing. And this is when usually a fair housing center or civil rights organization runs paired testing programs. They send volunteers, or sometimes they pay them, to pose as tenants. And if it's for an apartment, usually they're calling and they say, I'm looking for, I'm interested in this unit you have for rent. Some say that they use Section 8, and some say they don't. Some are African American, some are white, and you can see how they're treated. And if the ones who say they don't use Section 8 are shown the unit or offered the unit, and the ones who say they do are not, then that's the only true way we can see where this discrimination is happening. Those paired testing programs, they exist all over the country. They are limited by resources and volunteers to be those testers. So this is another way we can be involved, by volunteering with a paired testing program to help find where this discrimination is occurring so it can be prosecuted. Another issue with the Section 8 voucher program is how it's designed. So the way the Section 8 program works is when you receive a Section 8 benefit, you pay 30% of your monthly income, no matter what it is, towards your rent, and then the Section 8 voucher pays the rest of the rent up to a maximum amount. It makes some sense, but the maximum amount, how that is set, makes a big difference in how well this program can be used. So the maximum voucher amount is usually set taking a metropolitan area, which is a large area, full range of rents, the lowest to the highest, and taking the middle rent, and 10% below that middle rent is the maximum amount a voucher will pay. So by definition, over 60% of the rents in the entire metropolitan area are too expensive for voucher holders. They can't afford it. So it's not surprising that they can't use these vouchers to rent in those higher opportunity areas, which are usually higher cost areas. This is all a product of the design of the program. Well, the program has evolved some since it started. There was a lawsuit here in Dallas that changed how that maximum amount is set so that now it's in some places based on a smaller area of rents, so a zip code or a group of zip codes, and the median rent in that smaller area is the maximum rent the voucher will pay in that small area. So it pays more in high-cost areas and less in lower-cost areas, which makes some sense. Starting next year, 65 metropolitan areas around the country will be required to use this rent payment standard. It's called the Small Area Fair Market Rent Standard. If you're interested, I could get you the list of those 65 areas, but even beyond that, so if we live in one of those 65 areas, we got to make sure that those public housing authorities are implementing this new rent payment standard effectively and faithfully. And if we don't, public housing authorities outside of these 65 metro areas can also adopt voluntarily a small area rent standard. So that's another thing we can advocate for in our own communities that goes a long way towards increasing opportunity for Section 8 voucher holders. And I see, okay, steal a couple more minutes because he just turned around. But I want to give just one more quick example. One more quick example of another strategy that has to do with increasing home ownership opportunities. I'm almost done. Increasing home ownership opportunities for African Americans in every community, any community they want to buy a home in. We can do this through reforming the credit scoring system, providing subsidies, down payment assistance, home ownership counseling, and education. All of these are programs that can happen locally through our own programs. And I want to give one example of a down payment assistance program that was born out of a racial justice discussion group at a congregation in Pasadena, California. They started talking about the history of Pasadena and how segregated it is. And one of the people in this group, she has a business degree and a real estate license. She decided it's time to do something about this and started an organization that raises money and provides grants to individuals all over the country, African American and Hispanic home buyers, to buy homes. So how she describes it is she's acting as family for these home buyers who don't have family wealth because of these government policies. And it's a great program. It's a few years in. We can replicate this kind of program in our own communities. And she's now getting sort of remedial reconciliation payments as donations. So there's a law firm in Pasadena that was the firm that wrote the restrictive covenants in that city, and now, touts itself as being very progressive and community-oriented, and it's reconciling with that history by donating money. One way they're reconciling is donating money to this organization. Another white individual whose parents had a home in Pasadena, when they passed and he sold the home, as part of his sort of reconciling with the racial history of his city, he's donating 10% of the proceeds of that home to this organization. So these kinds of reconciliatory efforts and individual and collective efforts are essential, and we can sort of expand them and broaden their reach around the country. And these are the kinds of things that we need and that are within our reach to do in our own communities.